Creative destruction is our middle name, both within our own society and abroad. We tear down the old order every day, from business to science, literature, art, architecture, and cinema, to politics and the law. Our enemies have always hated this whirlwind of energy and creativity, which menaces their traditions, whatever they may be, and shames them for their inability to keep pace. We must destroy them to advance our historic mission. This is a quotation from neoconservative, ex-Pentagon official Michael Ledeen in his book, The War Against the Terror Masters. The following are quotations from the backs of VHS copies of Mad Max, 1979, and Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, 1982. Max goes on his rampage of revenge, taking over the last of the powerful police cars and tearing up the highways in a supercharged last-ditch pursuit. There's no real hope for him, but because of some particular talent he's got, like Max's skill on the highway, he's able to give a new order. Thanks to Max, the new order is born. There's a striking similarity in these quotations. Both neoconservative reality and action movie fantasy hinge on the ideas of creative destruction. Both of these concepts deal with men believing in a just cause and unleashing holy hell on their warped, evil enemies in order to bring about a better, brighter future. To understand this similarity, one needs to understand American culture of the 1970s and 80s, as well as the birth of neoconservatism. Neoconservatism is a radical segment of the Republican Party, which had its roots in mid-20th century Trotskyism and Jewish liberalism, but then gravitated toward the right. Early neoconservatives included Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz. Neoconservatism combined Ronald Reagan's ideals of militant anti-communism and democratic conservatism, coupled with Bolshevik Trotskyite utopian radicalism. My goal through this thesis is to show the relationships and similarities between neoconservatism and the action movies of the 1980s. This thesis will begin by analyzing the origins of neoconservatism and neoconservative ideology, which was born in the intellectual exodus from the Democratic Party of the 1970s to the more hawkish Republican Party. This thesis will further show how this exodus led to the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s and ultimately to the George W. Bush administration of the 21st century, the ideals of opportunity stemming from crisis, being willing to use violent means to achieve just ends, militancy, moral certainty, and staying the course in the face of adversity are all present in the neoconservative ideology of yesterday and today, as well as in the epic action movies of the 1980s. According to neoconservative logic, these beliefs defeated the USSR. Therefore, they can defeat any opponent of the United States. The source material for this thesis includes historical synopses of neoconservative evolution, neoconservative interviews, neoconservative policy statements, documentation of the close relationship between the Pentagon and Hollywood, and political critiques of neoconservatism. In addition, neoconservative letters to political leaders will be used to support my assessment of neoconservatism. The movies that will be analyzed as examples of these similarities will begin chronologically briefly in the 1970s, then focus primarily on the 1980s, and then briefly focus on post-1980s examples of neoconservative content in action movies. The list of films that will be focused on includes Dirty Harry, Death Race 2000, Mad Max, Rambo Trilogy, Delta Force, television drama 24, and Frank Miller's 300. It is not my desire to condemn these inadvertently or advertently propagandistic movies, nor is my desire to condemn neoconservatism in this thesis. On a personal level, my own Judeo-Christian social democratic worldview is very idealistic, but also anti-neoconservative. However, I personally enjoy these movies on an aesthetic, artistic, and intellectual level. I do not dismiss these films as frivolous junk food created for mass consumption. Rather, I see these movies as well-crafted works of art that have either intentional or unintentional social and political impact. Although some of these films may be considered B-movies, I do not believe in the elitist concept of cheesiness. The ascendance of the neoconservative George W. Bush administration and the advent of the Second Iraq War have coincided with many of these movies being broadcast frequently on cable television. In fact, as I typed this on April 29, 2007 at 11:30 p.m., Arnold Schwarzenegger's neoconservative-style action epic, Commando, is being broadcast on the cable network, American Movie Classics. I find it hard to believe that the cable broadcast blitzkrieg of these movies is unrelated to the social and political impact of neoconservative rule. I am approaching this subject matter with the idea that essentially everything in television and movies serves a combination of ideological, political, and/or financial interests. I also believe that one of the reasons there is such a strong resemblance between the neoconservative worldview and 1980s action movies is the tradition of the strong, hard-edged American cowboy, weathered by the harsh realities of frontier life. This iconic figure is part of the fabric of the American patriotism which neocons cherish. In the case of the 1980s action hero, the protagonist is strong and hard-edged, usually as a result of a terrible unfair wrong suffered in the past, often the murder of a loved one, and/or the experience of the horrors of war. Both the American cowboy and the 1980s action hero use individuality and force to shape a bright new tomorrow. A major factor in the way films are presented is the fact that the Pentagon, which is subject to neoconservative influence, has the power to reject Hollywood requests for access to military resources if the scripts portray the military in an unfavorable way. My goal is to show the relationships between neoconservatism and 1980s action movies by examining the content of both paradigms and showing both a direct and indirect connection by the statements of the directors and producers of the movies, the statements of neoconservative politicians, the statements of political intellectuals, and the sheer quantity of similarity in the content of neoconservative ideology and the content of these movies. I do not believe that Dick Cheney is necessarily sitting in a smoke-filled room telling the Viacom Corporation what to air on television. There is, however, a more than 50-year relationship between the Pentagon and Hollywood, in which officials in charge of public relations at the Pentagon approve or disapprove the giving of military equipment to filmmakers based on how favorably the military appears in a prospective film. There is also a documented relationship between media conglomerates that portray government and military agendas in a positive light, and the legislation that economically benefits these conglomerates. In addition, I also believe that there is a clear relationship between what is in movies and television and what the political climate is. Furthermore, politicians and political interest groups have been using Madison Avenue audiovisual marketing to promote their agendas since the Eisenhower administration. My goal for this thesis is to show that there is a clear connection between the neoconservative worldview and the content of the action movies of the 1980s, neoconservative history, ideology, and the relationship of the political power structure to Hollywood. In order to understand the connection between neoconservatism and the action movie genre of the 1980s, it is important to understand the origins of neoconservatism and the time in which this worldview took shape. Neoconservatism has its roots in the Trotskyite, socialist, and liberal intellectual movements of the U.S. During the early to mid-20th century, the allegiances of these individuals lay with Democratic hawks, such as Franklin D., Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, and even Lyndon Johnson. Their heroes were militant anti-Soviets who defended Western democracy but had ideals beyond simple economic self-interest. The man considered the godfather of neoconservatism is Irving Kristol. Kristol started his career in the 1930s as a Trotskyite, New York City Jewish intellectual. From 1947 to 1952, Kristol was managing editor of Commentary magazine, a journal published by the American Jewish community. This magazine would later be referred to as the Neocon Bible. However, as the 1960s and the Vietnam War came, so did anti-establishment radicalism, which began to take hold of segments of the American psyche. By the late 1960s, the Democratic Party was becoming fragmented and weak, divided between anti-war counterculture doves and the LBJ-style hawks. Ronald Reagan, who left the Democratic Party even before the Vietnam War, stated that the Democratic Party had left him, not vice versa. This tension in the U.S. and in the Democratic Party, coupled with 1972 presidential candidate George McGovern's dovish approach to the Vietnam War, caused a number of intellectual Democrats, such as Irving Kristol and other like-minded prestigious liberals like Norman Podhoretz, to move to the right as a result of feeling isolated and ignored in their own party. These intellectual converts became known as neoconservatives. The neo, or new aspect of the name, not only referred to the idea of these intellectuals being recent converts to conservatism, but also referred to the fact that the neoconservatives strayed from the traditional conservative idea of maintaining the status quo through pragmatic containment of the USSR, semi-isolationism, and protection of corporate profit. Neoconservatism promoted a much more ambitious Republican Party that paralleled the Soviet ideal of building a global communist utopia. However, rather than building a communist utopia, neoconservatives sought to judiciously build a global Western capitalist democratic utopia by fighting the enemies of Western-style democracy. Irving Kristol stated that a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. A neoliberal is a liberal who's been mugged by reality but has refused to press charges. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was seen as the enemy of Western democracy. The USSR's prominence and its ideal of global communism prevented the neoconservatives' utopian dream of global democracy in U.S. prominence. Neoconservative icons of the late 1960s, such as Democratic Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, taught young proteges, such as Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, that trusting in corrupt, pragmatic, bureaucratic institutions was not efficient realism. Just before the Second U.S. Iraq War, Richard Pearl acknowledged that Scoop Jackson had taught him and his peers that idealism is the real realism. Pearl also stated, the lesson of history is that democracies do not initiate wars of aggression. And if we want to live in a peaceful world, then there's very little we can do to bring that about more effectively than promoting a democracy. While this statement totally ignores the past existence of the U.S. Civil War, it does represent the neoconservative and Maoist idea of destabilizing a situation in the short term, such as invading Iraq, in order to create long-term stability by building a stable Iraqi democracy. Irving Kristol, former Trotskyite, godfather of neoconservatism, and father of Project for the New American Century think tank chairman Bill Kristol, echoed this statement when he declared that the historical task and political purpose of neoconservatism in general was to convert the Republican Party and American conservatism in general, against their respective wills, into a new kind of conservative politics suitable to governing a modern democracy. The bottom line of neoconservatism is a combination of moral ideals married to military strength as a practical solution to achieve the just end of global U.S.-led Western democracy. These sentiments are echoed by Irving Kristol's son, the famous journalist and political activist William Kristol, in statements such as, American power should be used not just in the defense of American interest, but for the promotion of American principles. Neocon Richard Pearl has stated, concerning the roles that he and other neoconservatives played in the Bush administration, we certainly prepared to shift direction and in a radical direction. I think it's fair to say radical. The following is the full statement of principles for the Project for the New American Century think tank, in which members of this neoconservative intellectual circle clearly articulate the neoconservative worldview. American foreign and defense policy is adrift. Conservatives have criticized the incoherent policies of the Clinton administration. They have also resisted isolationist impulses from within their own ranks. But conservatives have not confidently advanced a strategic vision of America's role in the world. They have not set forth guiding principles for American foreign policy. They have allowed differences over tactics to obscure potential agreement on strategic objectives. And they have not fought for a defense budget that would maintain American security and advance American interests in the new century. We aim to change this. We aim to make the case and rally support for American global leadership. As the 20th century draws to a close, the United States stands as the world's preeminent power. Having led the West to victory in the Cold War, America faces an opportunity and a challenge. Does the United States have the vision to build upon the achievements of past decades? Does the United States have the resolve to shape a new century favorable to American principles and interests? We are in danger of squandering the opportunity and failing the challenge. We are living off the capital, both the military investments and the foreign policy achievements built up by past administrations. Cuts in foreign affairs and defense spending, inattention to the tools of statecraft, and inconstant leadership are making it increasingly difficult to sustain American influence around the world. And the promise of short-term commercial benefits threatens to override strategic considerations. As a consequence, we are jeopardizing the nation's ability to meet present threats and to deal with potentially greater challenges that lie ahead. We seem to have forgotten the essential elements of the Reagan administration's success. A military that is strong and ready to meet both present and future challenges, a foreign policy that boldly and purposefully promotes American principles abroad, and national leadership that accepts the United States' global responsibilities. Of course, the United States must be prudent in how it exercises its power, but we cannot safely avoid the responsibilities of global leadership or the costs that are associated with its exercise. America has a vital role in maintaining peace and security in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. If we shirk our responsibilities, we invite challenges to our fundamental interests. The history of the 20th century should have taught us that it is important to shape circumstances before crises emerge and to meet threats before they become dire. The history of this century should have taught us to embrace the cause of American leadership. Our aim is to remind Americans of these lessons and to draw their consequences for today. Here are 4 consequences. And we need to increase defense spending significantly if we are to carry out our global responsibilities today and modernize our armed forces for the future. And we need to strengthen our ties to democratic allies and to challenge regimes hostile to our interests and values. We need to promote the cause of political and economic freedom abroad. And we need to accept responsibility for America's unique role in preserving and extending an international order friendly to our security, our prosperity, and our principles. Such a Reaganite policy of military strength and moral clarity may not be fashionable today, but it is necessary if the United States is to build on the successes of this past century and to ensure our security and our greatness in the next. Elliott Abrams, Gary Bauer, William J. Bennett, Jeb Bush, Dick Cheney, Elliott A. Cohen Midge, Decter, Paula Dobriansky, Steve Forbes, Aaron Friedberg, Francis Fukuyama, Frank Gaffney, Fred C. Eichel, Donald Kagan, Zalmay Khalilzad, Louis Libby, Norman Podhoretz, Dan Quayle, Peter W., Rodman Stephen P., Rosen Henry S., Rowan Donald Rumsfeld, Vin Weber, George Weigel, Paul Wolfowitz. Former Reagan administration member and neoconservative Michael Leedon has stated, change, above all violent change, is the essence of human history. This and other neoconservative statements clearly illustrate the well-intentioned, nationalistic, radical, Bolshevik roots in which neoconservatism was born. Leedon's statement greatly resembles the logic of other leftists who broke from Bolshevism, like Chairman Mao Zedong. Mao stated in 1966, "Great chaos will lead to great order. Everything is turned upside down. I love great upheavals." This line of Hegelian dialectic logic of both the communist left and neoconservative right lent itself well to the Cold War, which was a seemingly endless struggle between two great superpowers. The perpetual war between the USA and USSR would assure that progress for humanity would be made. This logic would serve the interests of the Pentagon economically and ideologically, as the Pentagon became infiltrated by the military-industrial complex and neoconservative ideologies. The Pentagon has historically influenced Hollywood. During World War II, at the request of the U.S. government, Frank Capra directed the Why We Fight propaganda documentary series in order to boost support for the war at home. Due to the immense influence, power, and potential conflicting agendas in the Pentagon and in Hollywood, the creation of the Department for Public Affairs Office was created in 1949 in order to regulate the relationship between the Pentagon and the film industry. This resulted in a bureaucratic institution designed to deal with Hollywood movie makers by giving them access to military equipment, planes and vehicles, all fruits of the American military-industrial complex, services of consultants, stock footage of past wartime activities, and other resources which allow for realistic, exciting filmmaking in exchange for positive portrayal of the military in films. In charge of the scrutinizing process are military public relations offices, specifically the Office of the Chief of Motion Picture Production, which reviews scripts before granting approval. This position was first filled by Don Baruch from 1949 to 1989, and then by Phil Strub from 1989 to the present. The exact criteria imposed by the Pentagon changed over the decades, becoming more specific over time. In the 1950s to early 1960s, the main criterion was that the film should be in the best interest of the military. One film containing a scene that Baruch deemed not in the best interest of the military was in Daryl Zanuck's The Longest Day, about the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Zanuck included a scene in the distribution cut which was supposed to have been deleted since it showed an American soldier killing Germans trying to surrender. Because of this scene and other inaccuracies in the movie, from 1962 to 1965, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs Arthur Sylvester spearheaded the overhauling of military policies to give the Pentagon more control over actual film content in exchange for assistance. Phil Strub has stated the traditional position of the Pentagon that any film that portrays the U.S. military as negative is not realistic to us. Since for the Pentagon, realism is inexorably linked to a positive portrayal of the military, his stated 3 guidelines for a war film's approval by the Pentagon are also telling. In addition to being as realistic, i.e., positive as possible, the film must educate the public about the strength of the U.S. military and also be useful in inspiring recruitment. The fact that Strub's militaristic idealism resembles militant neoconservative patriotism is no coincidence. Strub's boss, Pentagon spokesman Lawrence Derrida, is a former scholar of the Neoconservative Heritage Foundation and was special assistant to famous neocon, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Neoconservative presence in the Pentagon was notable in the 1980s. This coincides with the content of the action movies of the 1980s, increasingly reflecting militant, patriotic neoconservatism. Neoconservative intellectual Richard Pearl, the architect of the creative destruction agenda to reshape the Middle East, served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Security Policy from 1981 to 1987. Well-known neoconservative Douglas Feith, who recently served in the number 3 position in the Pentagon in the neoconservative George Bush administration, previously served as Middle East specialist for the National Security Council in the Reagan years from 1981 and 1982. Neocon Frank Gaffney Jr., who is quoted as saying that it is the United States mission to promote world peace through American strength, served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control under Richard Pearl, and was nominated to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy by Ronald Reagan. The infamous president of the World Bank and head architect of the Second U.S. Iraq War, Paul Wolfowitz, served as Undersecretary of Defense from 1989 to 1993. This position allowed Wolfowitz, along with Louis Scooter Libby, the chance to draft the defense planning guidance, which called for U.S. military dominance over Eurasia, the Middle East, and other nations seeking weapons of mass destruction in order to build a new century of American dominance now that the socialist sphere of influence of the 20th had evaporated with the collapse of the USSR. In terms of dealing directly with Hollywood in the 1980s and pushing the over-the-top military aesthetic, no one had more influence with Hollywood than Don Baruch, whose official title was Chief Motion Picture Production of the Department of Defense Public Affairs Office. Like the neocons, Baruch hearkened back to the ideal of a morally upright man of the FDR era, who did not like to cooperate with anyone. Baruch had a strong reputation for turning down movies that were not over-the-top military action fantasies that served as recruiting posters, such as Top Gun. Even action film legend Clint Eastwood, character Dirty Harry himself, was forced to revise his script due to Don Baruch. The film in question was Eastwood's Grenada-based war film, Heartbreak Ridge. The Pentagon told Eastwood to remove mention of the 1983 terrorist bombing of a Marine barracks in Beirut in order to comply with Pentagon standards. A particularly interesting action movie example that shows the Pentagon's power and ability to meticulously shape an action film's content is the example of Star Trek IV, The Long Voyage Home. Despite the fact that the original Star Trek television series began as a science fiction Cold War allegory that romanticized the U.S., Navy through the American-like Starfleet Federation, fighting the violent Soviet-like Klingon Empire, Don Baruch had several problems with the Star Trek IV's script. Star Trek IV's premise was that Captain Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise had to travel back in time to 1980s San Francisco in order to revive 2 humpback whales to save the future. A significant part of the film was to be on the USS Enterprise of the 1980s, which was a Navy ship. Harve Bennett, the producer of Star Trek IV, had gotten Baruch's blessing to use a Navy ship in the past on the television movie Family Flight. However, Baruch refused to let Bennett have access to the USS Ranger, the ship Bennett had requested, since the USS Enterprise was unavailable. Baruch denied Bennett's request because a scene in the script had beloved Star Trek characters Chekhov and Uhura stealthily sneaking on board the Navy's nuclear weapon, carrying Enterprise and fighting with Navy guards. This resulted in Chekhov's being interrogated and becoming wounded in a gunfight in an escape from the ship. This then led to another scene where Captain Kirk, Bones, and a new character named Jillian had a shootout with the U.S. Navy while rescuing the wounded Chekhov. Baruch and the Navy did not like the fact that Chekhov and Uhura were able to sneak aboard a nuclear carrier, which they felt made the Navy look weak. Therefore, the scene was rewritten to have the 2 crew members beamed into the ship. Furthermore, the Pentagon did not want the Navy being portrayed as the bad guys who fought against Captain Kirk's crew, so the script was changed to have Chekhov captured and interrogated by an FBI official instead of Navy security, and be accidentally wounded by himself in his attempt to escape. In addition, San Francisco policemen became the ones with whom Captain Kirk and company had a shootout, not Navy guards. Therefore, the potentially unflattering portrayal of the Navy was taken out of the film, and Bennett was able to have his request granted. Admiral Jack A. Garrow, the Navy's chief of information, stated that the producers of Star Trek IV were most cooperative. Films made during the late 1980s, such as Oliver Stone's Vietnam epics, Platoon, and Born on the 4th of July, did not pass the standards of the Pentagon due to their unflattering portrayal of the Army. During the liberal 1990s, movies such as Memphis Belle, 1992, A Few Good Men, 1996, Courage, Under Fire, and 1993, Heaven and Earth were also denied Pentagon aid. However, films which criticized aspects of the military, defying Pentagon specifications and foregoing its assistance, were the exception rather than the rule. In general, the presence of neoconservative and non-neoconservative hawks in the Pentagon, the influence of the military-industrial complex, which produces the equipment so valuable for the realism of Hollywood films, the Army's public relations agenda, and Hollywood's thirst for cash and high-quality filmmaking have, in many cases, all dovetailed together into making big, bold, idealistic, patriotic action films. It is important not to underestimate the role that the military-industrial complex plays as a catalyst for the militaristic psyche of the Pentagon, which in turn influences the content of action films. Ironically, it was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former five-star general and commander of Allied forces during World War II, who coined this term in a dire prediction about the harmful potential of the military-industrial complex. In his farewell speech at the end of his presidency, Eisenhower warned, "We have been compelled to create a permanent armament industry of vast proportions. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of federal government. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to recognize its grave implications. We must never let the wake of this combination endanger liberty or democratic process." In the pilot episode of Miami Vice, a young drug dealer named Corky, looking to go into business for himself, tells undercover vice cop Sonny Crockett, Don Johnson, "Free enterprise, dude, is the basis for Western democracy. Money and self-interest are the essence of capitalism, and the United States has become interchangeable with capitalism on the global stage. Every decade since World War II, the United States has been involved in elective military conflicts. This has allowed the military-industrial complex to stay in business, constantly pumping out new weapons, vehicles, ships, and equipment. This not only keeps the corporations making these war machines fat and happy, but it also serves the interests of congressmen who procure manufacturing jobs for their states due to the military-industrial complex. The U.S. government's love affair with the military has manifested itself in interesting ways. Under the chairmanship of Republican Michael Powell, son of former Bush administration Secretary of Defense Colin Powell, the Federal Communications Commission, supported by the Republican-dominated United States Senate and by the neoconservative Bush administration, rewarded Hollywood studios and media conglomerates that promoted patriotic militancy in the wake of 9 divided by 11 legislatively by increasing the criminalization of internet file sharing and loosening station ownership limits, making it easier for media conglomerates to consolidate power. The underhanded financial interests of the U.S. power structure, coupled with the well-intentioned but radical imperial utopian militancy of the neoconservatives, has made it in the Pentagon's financial and ideological interest to promote militancy and patriotic ideals in the action movies that shape the minds and morals of the masses. Analysis of 1970s action movies: Dirty Harry, Death Race, 2000 Max. As the United States was struggling through the 1970s with the tension of the Vietnam War, urban crime, and a loss of identity due to liberal multicultural political correctness, neoconservative ideals such as moral certainty and brute strength in order to bring back traditional American ideals and Western democratic stability in the U.S. From the brink of chaos, began to appear in action movies such as Dirty Harry, 1971, Death Race, 2000, 1975, and on an international level, Mad Max, 1979. Dirty Harry reflects the disillusionment, amorality, and inefficiency of liberal politics. This is important because it was a similar disillusionment with the left of the 1960s and 70s that caused the first-generation neocons like Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz to leave the Democratic Party and become Republicans. Inspired by the real-life incident of the Zodiac Killer, Dirty Harry, 1971, directed by Don Siegel, was a gritty police movie that took place on the crime-soaked streets of San Francisco, a metaphor for the weak and innocent of American society being victimized by an unruly, immoral generation of criminals that hid behind due process and the U.S. Constitution while innocent civilians suffered at the hands of these criminals. The timid San Francisco Police Department, which had its hands tied by procedure and due process, was unable to keep order. San Francisco's timid mayor was more concerned with the opinion of the press and upholding the legal system than protecting the citizens that the system was meant to protect. It was in this environment that Inspector Dirty Harry Callahan, Clint Eastwood, took center stage. Harry was a hard-edged, stoic, wisecracking, stressed-out everyman with a moral purpose. He was sickened by seeing American social order crumble around him. He was angered by seeing innocent girls raped and murdered, while the ruthless criminals responsible for the atrocities walked free because of legal technicalities. His solution was to walk outside of what he saw as the corrupt, inefficient system and use brute force for the greater moral good. Though he drew the criticism of the San Francisco's brass, Harry got results because he was not afraid to do what had to be done. which is to bring a new social order through violence. In the movie, San Francisco began to be terrorized by a serial killer who called himself Scorpio. Scorpio demanded that the city of San Francisco pay him $100,000, or he would continue to terrorize the city. The mayor and the police commissioner agreed to pay him despite Harry's protest. Hoping to be of use despite the weakness of the city leaders, Harry accepted the task of bringing ransom money to Scorpio, who killed his young female hostage anyway. Although Harry arrested Scorpio, the criminal was released due to a violation of his rights and inadmissible evidence, only to hijack a school bus full of children. Now taking matters into his own hands, Harry tracked down Scorpio, killed him in self-defense, and saved the children. Showing his disdain for the weak city officials, Harry, like the cowboy sheriff played by Gary Cooper in the 1950s Western High Noon, threw his badge away in the closing scene and went off into the distance. In many ways, Dirty Harry mirrors the neoconservative movement, both in its philosophy and its response to the Democratic Party. Like Harry, who walked away from the inefficient, weak SFPD, the neocons left the Democratic Party because it had embraced multicultural liberalism and abandoned its old ideals of tough-minded, no-nonsense patriotism, such as that of past President Harry Truman, who had authorized the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan at the end of World War II. Another way in which Dirty Harry reflects neoconservative ideals is the skepticism of negotiation. Filmed in 1971, Dirty Harry also reflects elements of the international scene of the time period. As frequently shown on nightly U.S. news programs of that time, Israel, which was surrounded on all fronts by hostile neighbors, had a policy of non-negotiation when its citizens were taken hostage by enemies. In addition, armed with an effective military, Israel had successfully defended itself in the 1967 war. Similarly, the neoconservative George W. Bush administration, filled with the disciples of 1970s neocon hero Scoop Jackson, has a tradition of preferring force to negotiation, which they believe to be synonymous with appeasement. As Dirty Harry saw the inefficiency of negotiation and constantly pleaded with his superiors to take care of the serial killer, Israel had seen the disastrous results of Europe and ghetto leaders like Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski's appeasement of Nazi Germany. In like manner, the GW Bush administration has become famous for its war on terror talking point: we don't negotiate with terrorists. One can also see a similarity with neoconservative disdain for the United Nations, an institution made for the purpose of global negotiation, and Harry's anger toward the SFPD and San Francisco's politicians. Another glaring similarity between Dirty Harry and the neoconservative worldview is the inefficiency of due process. The neoconservative Bush administration's Attorney General Alberto Gonzales has become infamous for calling the Geneva Convention's stance on due process and torture quaint, as well as being an advocate for NSA wiretapping without warrants. Gonzales's view mirrors Harry's use of torture to get results. Harry's belief in the inefficiency of going through bureaucratic channels to get warrants while innocents are attacked. And Harry's statements such as, "The law's crazy." Both Dirty Harry Callahan and the neoconservatives are pro-violence radicals with a moral purpose who are living in inefficient political systems, which hamper their agendas. As neoconservative intellectual Richard Pearl puts it, if you saw someone about to shoot at you, but you could shoot first, you'd do it. It's common sense. So what's the big fuss about preemption? Another film, Death Race 2000, reflected the neoconservative anger, disappointment, and fear over America's losing its way. To neoconservatives, American decadence, loss of purpose, and soft stance on totalitarianism would surely result in disaster and the loss of the post-Enlightenment democratic American identity. Illustrating these concerns, Death Race 2000, 1975, was a low-budget racing action movie directed by Paul Bartel and starring David Carradine, Mary Warrenoff, and Sylvester Stallone. The movie took place in a post-apocalyptic year. 2000 World War III had occurred in 1979, and America had become a dystopic amalgamation of communism and fascism. The country was governed by the oppressive Mr. President, a fascist who governed the U.S. from Moscow. The U.S. had lost the way of its great leaders, such as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Harry Truman. The masses were distracted from their oppression by a hedonistic transcontinental road race in which one dark hero, cloaked in black, who was David Carradine's Frankenstein, and four characters representing American violence and global oppression competed. The first archetype was a murderous cowgirl named Calamity Jane. The next dark character was a cute, young, blonde Nazi woman named Matilda the Hun. Following Matilda was a curly-haired gladiator named Nero the Hero. The final racer was Frankenstein's rival, Sylvester Stallone's Machine Gun Joe Paterbo, a Chicago gangster. The country was divided into factions supporting each driver and what they represented. The goal of the race was to get to California while running over as many civilians as possible. The winner would receive national fame and get to shake the hand of Mr. President. Each driver was assigned a navigator who serves as a sexual servant of the driver after the race. During the race, an Eleanor Roosevelt archetype named Thomasina Paine and a group of radicals who had grown tired of inefficient passive resistance used guerrilla warfare to pick off each driver. Frankenstein found out that his navigator was the granddaughter of the Thomasina Paine. The two then worked together, killing Machine Gun Joe in the death race, and ultimately working together to kill Mr. President as he waited to shake Frankenstein's hand. Following the success of our heroes, Frankenstein married his navigator and became the new president. Frankenstein restored traditional sovereignty and democracy to the U.S., abolished the death race, and appointed Thomasina Paine to his cabinet. Her response to any dissenters opposing the U.S. seemed to be, "If you don't like the U.S., you can get out." As President Frankenstein drove away, he ran over the announcer of the death race, who opposed the abolishment of the race, showing that, at the end of the day, morally motivated violence will lead to stability. Intentional or not, this movie embodied the neoconservative movement of the 1970s by showing how American weakness and instability in the Cold War would lead to disaster. If America were weak, it would not be able to stand up to the USSR and maintain global and domestic morality. Furthermore, Death Race 2000 showed that the worst aspects of America and the world would metastasize itself to the American identity if America were to lose its way. Internal division, decadence, and apathetic passivity, all social problems of the 1970s, caused a dystopian disaster in Death Race 2000. The way to get America back on track from the mess that it had gotten itself into in Death Race 2000 was to use the original neoconservative model of hawkish violence, New Deal ethics, and stay-the-course consistency to achieve the noble goal of restoring democracy, truth, justice in the American way. In Death Race 2000, the use of violence and romanticizing of traditional neoconservative heroes, like Harry Truman and Eleanor Roosevelt, also spoke to the neoconservative identity by showing neoconservative political icons, as well as showing the neoconservative violence streak, which selectively creates new order from destruction and uses crisis as an opportunity to build a bright new tomorrow. Mad Max spoke to the influence that 20th century neoconservatism and Reaganite ideals had on American Cold War satellite countries like Australia. Like Death Race 2000 Mad Max, an Australian movie made in 1979 and starring a young Mel Gibson, was also a post-apocalyptic action movie that dealt with racing cars. Like Dirty Harry, Mad Max dealt with social instability, corrupt liberal bureaucracy, and crime. The scenario of Mad Max was one of a post-apocalyptic Australia, where law and order were in a state of decay. Motorcycle gangs were terrorizing the innocent, and the undermanned police were stretched too thin and were hindered by liberal lawyers and an antiquated justice system that could not address the problems of a post-World War III world. The hero who walked in this nightmare is Mel Gibson's Max, a good-hearted family man who feared the violent streak within himself. He saw his own violence, his police chief's naive desire to bring back the hero to society, and the maiming and killing of his friends and colleagues, and tried to escape the challenges of this modern world by vacationing with his family. However, a biker gang that had a score to settle with Max found him, along with his wife and baby, on vacation. The gang separated the family and ran over Max's wife and son, killing his son and severely disfiguring his wife, putting her on the brink of death. Max went mad, got in his police car, and hunted down the biker gang, killing all of them. Max brought justice and order through moral violence, and now wandered the open, empty, parched highways of tomorrow in search of something more in his bleak future. Like Death Race 2000, Mad Max addressed the prospect of a post-apocalyptic future. In the case of Mad Max, however, the cause for World War III stemmed from the needless global jockeying for position between the USA and USSR, as opposed to an unstable America leading to a global disaster. What most resembles neoconservatism in Mad Max is the yearning for the order of the good old days, the romanticizing of the ideal of the good guy, policeman, and the use of violence to bring justice and order to a failing, broken world. Mad Max reflected the turbulent 1970s, in which the nationalistic Western standards of the 1940s and 50s were being swallowed up by the seemingly chaotic standards of liberal counterculture movements and anti-establishment radicalism. This was the case with the U.S. Democratic Party of the late 1960s. The party's loss of traditional values led to instability and the abandonment of people like the neoconservatives who believed in the traditional, tough moral standards of yesterday and wanted to use those standards to create a bright tomorrow. Action movies of the 1980s. First Blood. Rambo, First Blood Part 2, Rambo 3, Delta Force. As the 1970s came to a close, America as a whole had grown weary of the American malaise that reached its peak during the Democratic Carter administration. Like the neocons of the 1960s and 70s, the American people had become disillusioned with the inefficient Democratic Party and voted former Hollywood star Republican Ronald Reagan into the presidency along with his vice president, George H.W. Bush. With Reagan came neoconservatives who found themselves in positions of influence within the Reagan-Bush machine. Neocons found that they fit in well with Reagan, who was in many ways a neocon himself. Reagan spoke militant, morally certain, neoconservative, anti-communist rhetoric about America's global military role in stopping the USSR. Like many neocons, Reagan was also a former New Deal Democrat. Reagan had become disillusioned with the Democratic Party by the time of Lyndon B. Johnson and the Great Society. Prominent neocons like Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, John Bolton, Donald Rumsfeld, Elliott Abrams, Robert Kagan, and Prince of the Neocons, Bill Kristol, son of first-generation neocon Irving Kristol, all found positions within the Reagan administration. Reagan showed his neoconservative philosophical leanings and his intense Hollywood charisma with phrases like, they say there are only two places where communism works. In heaven, where they don't need it, and in hell, where they've already got it. This blunt, creative 1983 comment could not only be appropriate on Reagan's campaign trail, but also in a Chuck Norris movie like The Delta Force, 1986. The Reagan administration was noted for turning public events into carefully staged, Hollywood-style moments with Reagan taking his familiar center stage. Reagan's campaign manager, Lee Atwater, stated the importance of using television production values and technology to package Reagan in order to sell him to the American people. This was seen in Reagan's trip to the North Korean border, where he was surrounded by a church choir of South Korean children and a legion of U.S. soldiers. Opponent Walter Mondale's campaign manager readily admitted to the Reagan campaign's skillful use of packaging and presenting Reagan to the American people. Reagan's biographer Lou Cannon stated, "Movies were the raw material from which he drew scenes and sustenance." Reagan's 1984 campaign stop at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, Tennessee, had Reagan surrounded by his flag-waving supporters as confetti rained down to Lee Greenwood singing, "God Bless the USA." This resembled the closing scenes of action movies like Rocky IV, 1985, in which Rocky was draped in the American flag amidst a crowd of pro-American Russians converts, while John Cafferty's song, "Hearts on Fire," was blaring. The Rambo trilogy, 1982 to 1989, is synonymous with the Reagan administration. The Rambo films not only reflect neoconservative militancy, the violent neoconservative dialectic and anti-communism, but the films also reflect the need to stay the course and keep one's moral purpose in the face of adversity. This three-part saga chronicles the adventures of John Rambo, Sylvester Stallone, a stoic Green Beret Vietnam veteran who has been betrayed by the corrupt masses and the corrupt elite of the U.S. In Episode 1, First Blood, 1982, Rambo was an unkempt drifter walking through small-town America. He found that the last surviving member of his squad had died from the effects of Agent Orange. Distraught, Rambo wandered into a town but was arrested for vagrancy by a corrupt sheriff. Once in custody, Rambo was abused by the corrupt police officers of the town and started to have flashbacks of being tortured at the hands of the Viet Cong. In a state of infuriated madness, Rambo defeated the police, took refuge in a nearby forest, and began using guerrilla tactics he mastered in Vietnam to fight off his pursuers, giving the ungrateful American masses a taste of what the hell of Vietnam had been like. When Rambo's mentor, Colonel Troutman, came from Washington, D.C., to try to reason with Rambo, John justified his actions by claiming that they drew first blood. The conflict between Rambo and the corrupt sheriff continued, culminating in Rambo's being about to kill the sheriff, only to be stopped by Colonel Troutman, who told Rambo that both the Vietnam War and the war waged between the small town and Rambo were over. In response, Rambo screamed that he could not simply turn off his war instincts and the memory of Vietnam. With tears in his fiery eyes, Rambo explained that he and his fellow soldiers had given everything they could to win the Vietnam War, but the corrupt politicians of Washington and the know-nothing masses wouldn't let them win. Rambo continued that in Vietnam he was the ultimate soldier, but back on the home front, he couldn't get a job parking cars. Troutman, the wise, stoic father figure, sadly led Rambo away from the destruction Rambo had created and into the hands of the authorities, who waited outside Rambo's wake of destruction. The very title, First Blood, is significant to the American and neoconservative psyche. Many historians believe that neoconservative icon, Franklin D. Roosevelt, allowed Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor to happen in order to thrust the USA into World War II. The logic was that the bad guy Japanese drew first blood, and now America, the victim, had the moral obligation to defend itself by unleashing holy hell on the bad guys. One can see how Rambo is an allegory for the USA. First Blood reflected the damage control that the Reagan administration was trying to do in the wake of the self-pitying, anti-military undercurrent of the Carter administration. First Blood shifted the blame for the failure of the Vietnam War away from the soldiers and moral hawks. The blame for the U.S. defeat was the fault of the corrupt, weak establishment and know-nothing liberals who came to characterize everything that neocons hated about America. When talking about the United Nations, which neocons consider a bloated, bureaucratic institution designed to hinder what they would see as necessary wars, neoconservative Richard Pearl called the United Nations a corrupt, weak, and ineffective institution. Pearl's description of the UN mirrors the portrayal of the police force in First Blood. The police force was corrupt because it took pleasure in harassing and beating Rambo. It was weak and ineffective because it could not kill or arrest Rambo. Rambo, on the other hand, was a violent outsider with a moral purpose that brought new order from destruction. Troutman, Rambo's father figure, acted as a relic from the golden age of America. He was moral, wise, compassionate, and above all strong. These characteristics of Troutman mirror the standards of the America remaining from the 1950s. The second episode in the Rambo trilogy is 1985's Rambo, First Blood Part 2, written by Sylvester Stallone and James Cameron, and directed by George P. Cosmatos. Here the viewer experiences a much more action-packed, over-the-top Rambo, who is more neo-conservative folklore and macro-political allegory, as opposed to the more micro-political, allegorical, nuanced, emotionally distraught Rambo of First Blood. As First Blood 2 began, Colonel Troutman visited Rambo in prison and told Rambo, who seemed to have found a sense of belonging in prison, that America needed Rambo again. And unlike in Vietnam, this time it is up to Rambo whether he wins or loses. Rambo agreed to do the mission proposed by Troutman and was briefed in Thailand that there was a growing mass inquiry about lost American prisoners of war from Vietnam. Though the politically sensitive military brass didn't think there were any prisoners of war left, Rambo was instructed by Washington, D.C. Special Operations Commander Marshal Murdoch to take pictures of suspected Vietnamese prisons to see if there were any American prisoners left. When Rambo was shocked that he was not going to rescue the prisoners of war, he was assured that Troutman would lead an extraction team if Rambo found anything. Dropped into Vietnam at the Thailand border via helicopter, Rambo met his contact, a beautiful Thai woman who was charmed by Rambo's blunt sense of humor and gritty determination. The two arrived in Vietnam and found an American prisoner of war. The prisoner of war told Rambo there were more Americans besides himself being held. Like the soldiers let down by politicians during Vietnam War and the Vietnamese abandoned during the fall of Saigon, Murdoch, ignoring Troutman's protests, refused to rescue Rambo and the prisoner of war, who fell into the hands of the Vietnamese and Soviet army and were tortured. Aided by his contact, with whom he has fallen in love, Rambo escaped. When the girl was killed by the Vietnamese, Rambo then proceeded to single-handedly destroy the evil Soviet and Vietnamese forces. After releasing the malnourished prisoners of war, Rambo piled them into a Soviet helicopter that he has hijacked and flies the helicopter back to the U.S. base in Thailand. On his return, Rambo confronted Murdoch, demanding that all remaining POWs be rescued. When Troutman asked Rambo not hate America, Rambo replied that he would still gladly die for his country, but he wanted nothing to do with the corrupt establishment. When Troutman inquired how Rambo would be able to live without the battlefield surrounding him, Rambo replied that he would live day by day. The godfather of conservatism, Irving Kristol, is quoted as being overjoyed at the Rambo film's popularity. It proves Americans love war, and only the menace of a common enemy can unite a people. At the time of its release, Rambo First Blood 2 drew praise from neoconservative icon Ronald Reagan. On different occasions, Reagan used Rambo as a talking point. After the release of 39 American hostages in June 1985, Reagan said, "After seeing Rambo last night, I know what to do next time this happens." Several months later, campaigning for tax reform, Reagan said, "Let me tell you, in the spirit of Rambo, we're going to win this thing." A picture of Ronald Reagan can also be seen on the bulletin board in the background between Colonel Troutman and Murdoch in the Rambo First Blood Part 2 trailer. Rambo First Blood Part 2 combined moral certainty, militant strength, vigorous ambition, and criticism of the corrupt establishment that are crucial parts of the neoconservative worldview. In addition, the film was profoundly anti-communist. The woman Rambo loved was killed by communist soldiers. Furthermore, Rambo was tortured by a sadistic Russian interrogator who masked his cruelty by calling Rambo comrade, thereby showing the hypocrisy of Bolshevik communism. This is important due to the fact that although neoconservatism had its roots in Trotskyism, the movement grew to view the Soviet Union as a threat to U.S. morality and global prominence. Therefore, like Rambo, the neocons advocated militancy in order to defeat the seemingly invincible evil empire known as the USSR. Rambo 3, 1988 was an American love letter to the Mujahideen guerrillas who fought the USSR in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War. Rambo 3 was also believed to be the final chapter in the Rambo trilogy. However, Rambo 4 is coincidentally in production now, 2007, at the same time the neoconservative GW. Bush administration is in office. Rambo 3, like First Blood Part 2, is a profoundly over-the-top action epic tale that demonizes the Soviet Union. Neoconservative, moral militancy, creative destruction, bias against negotiation, and pragmatism are all demonstrated in this powerful film. As Rambo 3 began, Rambo was a carpenter in a Buddhist monastery in Thailand. Rambo competed in underground Thai stick fights in order to keep the monastery funded. Troutman met Rambo with a Washington representative and asked Rambo if he would accompany him in a covert operation to aid the Mujahideen freedom fighters against the USSR. Rambo declined, saying that he had put in his time. However, the next day, Rambo was informed by the representative who accompanied Troutman that the colonel had been captured by the Soviets. Rambo was told that the U.S. government could not act, or it would create an international incident. Given permission to go alone on a covert mission to free Troutman, Rambo encountered the Mujahideen freedom fighters on his trip to rescue Troutman and discovered they were a noble, gallant people resembling Americans. The Mujahideen were wise, God-fearing, strong-willed, and played a game similar to American football on horseback. Rambo was accepted into their tribe when Soviet fighter jets massacred most of the tribe, including women and children. Rambo informed the rest of the tribe that he was going to rescue his friend who had come to aid the tribe. The freedom fighters, however, feared that the Russians would attack the women and children if they accompanied Rambo. Rambo decided to go it alone and do what had to be done to save his greatest friend and father figure. Rambo was ultimately accompanied by the street-smart, friendly guide who took him to the Mujahideen camp, and a small boy who admired Rambo. After a failed attempt, Rambo stuck to his plan and returned to the Soviet base to rescue Troutman. As Rambo and Troutman escaped, they found themselves out in the open desert, surrounded by the entire Russian force occupying the area. The Russian commander who brutally tortured Troutman and the Afghans asked the two if they would negotiate a surrender. When Troutman asked Rambo what he thought, Rambo replied, "Fuck 'em." And then Rambo and Troutman unleashed holy hell on the entire Soviet force. Eventually, Rambo and Troutman appeared to be at a disadvantage, and when all seemed lost, the Mujahideen rode in on horseback, and Rambo and the rest of the good guys destroyed the Soviet force. Rambo and Troutman bid farewell to their Afghan friends, and Rambo gave the small boy who looked up to him the good luck charm he got from his love in First Blood Part 2. Troutman told Rambo that he thought the pair was getting soft, and Rambo replied, "Maybe a little." Rambo and Troutman drove off into the sunset. As they rode away, a caption came over the screen saying, "This film is dedicated to the gallant people of Afghanistan." Rambo's "fuck 'em" response to the Russians is interchangeable with the neoconservative GW. Bush administration's response to the Iraqis, Iranians, Syrians, and North Koreans in the course of the first 7 years of the Bush administration. When these nations, deemed evil by the neocons, asked for negotiation, the request met with the military and political wrath of the Bush administration. In addition to the creative radical destruction that Rambo 3 demonstrates, the film reflects another aspect of neoconservatism that neocons are less enthusiastic about, and that is the occasional necessity for pragmatism. When considering enemies to the U.S., neoconservatives Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, for example, tend to see nations as greater threats to the U.S. than small bands of guerrillas, terrorists, or freedom fighters. In 1988, the Soviet Union was viewed by neocons as the ultimate enemy. Therefore, the U.S. governments dealing with Arab extremists like the Mujahideen or Saddam Hussein during the 1980s was seen as an unpleasant pill that had to temporarily be swallowed. Neoconservatives like Richard Pearl stated the importance of disposing of Saddam Hussein once he had served his purpose in helping the U.S. In 1998, a letter from Project for the American Century think tank to President Bill Clinton stated with regard to the U.S., "Relationship to Slobodan Milosevic. Our deal with the devil had served its purpose. after the Cold War was over and the neoconservatives had regained influence over state policy and the presidency. Former allies like the gallant Afghan freedom fighters became terrorist members of the Axis of Evil. If the Rambo trilogy embodied the Reagan era's broader conservative Cold War militancy, 1986's Delta Force, starring Chuck Norris, perfectly embodied the militant ideals of neoconservatism. While Rambo 3 reflected the pragmatic agenda of helping Muslim extremists defeat the USSR, Delta Force did not hesitate to portray Muslim extremists as wild-eyed, evil terrorists. Delta Force was clearly inspired by two historical incidents. The first was the 1976 Israeli Entebbe hostage crisis, in which Israeli commandos rescued 100 hostages, mostly Israelis or Jews, held by pro-Palestinian hijackers at Entebbe Airport in Uganda. The second was the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, in which Shiite terrorists hijacked a plane from Athens and held American and Israeli hostages on board in exchange for the Kuwait 17 and 700 other Shiite prisoners held by Israel. Starring Chuck Norris, Lee Marvin, and pre-counterculture 1950s TV personality Joey Bishop, Delta Force was a well-crafted tribute to the moral use of American and Israeli militancy. Delta Force began in 1979 with the stout-hearted Delta Force, led by the grizzled veteran Colonel Nick Alexander and the ultimate fighting machine, Major Scott McCoy, Chuck Norris, attempting to rescue the 52 American hostages held in Iran. Due to the incompetence of the Washington bureaucrats relaying the orders to the Delta Force, the mission failed, and one of the members of the force was nearly killed. However, Major McCoy heroically rescued the Solider and caught up with the rest of the force as they left Iran. 7 years later, the Iranian terrorists were at it again. This time they had hijacked a plane in Athens filled with kind-hearted Jewish Americans, some of whom had survived the Holocaust. The terrorists' purpose was to force Israel to release the Shiite prisoners being held captive. The Delta Force was called into action. At first, it seemed that Major McCoy had given up life with Delta Force. However, once he saw the plight of the innocent on the evening news, he knew he had to use his militant power for the good of the oppressed, and donned his uniform once again. Due to the U.S. government's attempt at diplomacy, the Delta Force missed their opportunity to storm the plane and rescue the hostages. As with the actual TWA Flight 847 incident, the terrorists killed an American sailor to show how serious they were. The terrorists got reinforcements and flew to Lebanon. The Delta Force flew to Israel, America's greatest Middle Eastern ally. Thanks to the brave Israeli intelligence officer who died helping Major McCoy and his young protege, the Delta Force now knew where the hostages were being held. Major McCoy and the Delta Force stormed the terrorists' hideout in Lebanon. The ruthless Iranians were no match for the American muscle of the Delta Force, so they tried to negotiate. However, Major McCoy answered their request with his machine gun and rocket motorcycle. Unfortunately, McCoy's protege was fatally wounded by the terrorist leader. McCoy hunted the diabolical Shiite down and got his revenge. Thanks to the Delta Force and Israeli intelligence, the hostages were rescued. McCoy, his mentor, Colonel Alexander, and the Delta Force landed in Israel. While everyone on the plane was enjoying a nice, cold American Budweiser, McCoy's protege died, showing that the joy of the masses comes at a price. However, the plane lands amidst a sea of American and Israeli flags. Our heroes were heartened, seeing the hostages greeted by their families and the unbreakable bond between the two benevolent nations, the U.S. and Israel. The Delta Force boarded their plane and flew off to unknown challenges and adventures. Essentially, all aspects of the neoconservative identity were romanticized in Delta Force. A striking aspect of Delta Force was the romantic portrayal of Jewish Americans and the U.S. military's duty to protect them. The Jewish American hostages were of the same generation as the founding fathers of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz. Many neoconservatives are Jewish American and militantly pro-Israel, seeing a deep link between American ideals and regional political interests with those of Israel. For example, neoconservatives like Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith have worked with and been outspoken supporters of Israel's right-wing Likud party. Delta Force also reflects the neoconservative distaste for negotiation. In a 2004 press conference with former Iraqi Prime Minister Alawi, George Bush stated, "When governments negotiate with terrorists, everyone in the free world suffers. Rather than negotiate with the Iranians, who come from an oppressive theocracy that neoconservatives wish to destroy, Chuck Norris used creative destruction to get results as he mowed down his enemies with his rocket bike." It is important to note that neoconservatives such as Richard Pearl advocate destroying the Iranian regime by helping anti-government rebels, while the G.W. Bush administration and John McCain, the 2007 presidential candidate supported by William Kristol, appear to be trying to advance a full-scale military conflict with Iran. The neoconservatives desire to destroy the type of terrorists that appear in Delta Force and topple Islamic theocracies like Iran's regime, because Islamic terrorists and theocracies are not Western, capitalist, or democratic. Therefore, these Muslims offer nothing to the global marketplace. They are considered oppressive and immoral by neoconservatives. Prince of the Neocons. William Crystal articulated the neoconservative response to the most infamous terrorist attack on America, saying, "When September 11th happened, the president and his top advisors said to themselves, correctly, I think, we need to rethink American foreign policy. And I think that would have happened without September 11th. Conclusion: neoconservative action today and yesterday. The trend of neoconservative ideological reflection in the action movie genre has continued throughout the 1990s, with movies like Jean-Claude Van Damme's Street Fighter, a G.I. Joe-type story taking place in a country resembling Iraq that suffers from an evil dictator who must be removed from power by the morally upright American super soldier, Guile. In the 21st century, two of the most illustrative examples of works embracing the neocon ideology are Frank Miller's 300 Amperes comic book-style Greek historical epic, stressing the necessity to imperialize uncivilized, immoral Persians who threaten the West, and the Fox television drama 24 Amperes high-tech spy drama, made in the style of Stalinist paranoia propaganda. 24 is an especially interesting example of the neoconservatism in the action genre. 24 has drawn high praise from neoconservatives like Vice President Dick Cheney and the Neoconservative Heritage Foundation, which invited the cast of 24 to be part of a panel lecture on counterterrorism. The plot of 24 spends much of its time advocating neoconservative imperial practices like torturing terrorist suspects. 24 also spends much of its time creating an environment of perpetual terror, in which the government's employees with neoconservative values are the only characters who can be trusted to protect the weak. Many characters on 24 are loosely veiled portrayals of neoconservative political leaders and their traditional conservative and liberal opponents. For example, William Devane plays the silver-haired, moral, masculine, neoconservative Secretary of Defense Heller, who represents former George W. Bush administration Secretary of Defense, neoconservative Donald Rumsfeld. Jack Bauer, the protagonist, is a no-nonsense man of morals who, though he is not perfect, always does his best to do what is right in his chaotic environment. Jack is clearly a romantic portrayal of neoconservative protege President George W. Bush. Jack's mysterious, long-faced, wealthy, amoral father, who has a strained relationship with his moral son, is clearly the old-school conservative President George H.W. Bush. 24 is truly a profound reflection of neoconservatism on the action genre. In conclusion, one can see how the factors of political ideology, financial interest, and the environment of the masses all interacted to create an action movie genre that reflected and continues to reflect neoconservatism. While the political reality of neoconservatism may be militaristic and immoral, these films, like neoconservatism and Bolshevism, seek to use violence to illustrate a great moral ideal. That ideal is the dream of a future in which the weak are not oppressed and exploited by corrupt, self-serving individuals. Like the Soviet communists' failed gamble in Afghanistan, which contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union, the neoconservative tactic of bringing radical global revolution through violence seems to be destined for failure. This can be seen in State of the Current U.S., Imperial War in Iraq. That being said, the movies that were born from this radicalism are an epic, powerful, masterful, well-crafted, idealistic form of the action genre. Though neoconservatism may fall into the annals of history, like the great statues of Roman emperors and Greek gods, the Herculean adventures and personas of Rambo, Mad Max, and similar action heroes will live on in film history as a testament to the bold, over-the-top dreams of Western society. Bibliography: Bauer Yehuda, A History of the Holocaust. New York, Franklin Watts, 2001. BBC News. Link accessed April 2007. Boggs Carl, Pentagon Strategy, Hollywood, and Techno-War. New Politics. Vol. 11. No. One link. Buchanan, Patrick J. Where the Right Went Wrong. How Neoconservatives Subverted the Reagan Revolution and Hijacked the Bush Presidency. New York, Thomas Dunn Books. 2004. Bush, Joe. Quoted in September 2004 press conference and Prime Minister Alawi. Press conference at the Rose Garden link. Accessed May 2007. Campaigning on Q. The 1984 election. PBS. 1985. Christian Science Monitor. Empire Builders. Neoconservatives and their blueprint for. U.S. Power link. Accessed April 2007. Correspondence Report. Critics disturbed by Hollywood, defense relationship. Interview by Lisa Miller, ABC Online link. Accessed April 2007. Dirty Harry, The Malpaso Company, 1971. Jury Shadia, quoted in Myth of Neoconservative Foreign Policy by Daniel A. Munns. Yale University, 2006 link. Frontline. Link accessed. April 2007. Jeffords, Susan. Hard Bodies. Hollywood Masculinity in the Reagan Era. New. Brunswick, New Jersey, Rutgers University Press. 1994. Keyes, Richard. High Noon, The Big House Film Society. Link accessed March 2007. Lynch, Michael. Mayo. London and New York, Rutledge. 2004. Mad Max. VHS box. Vestron Video. 1988. Martin, Andrew, and Patrice Petro, ed. Rethinking Global Security Media, Popular. Culture and the War on Terror. New Brunswick, New Jersey, Rutgers University Press. 2006. Miller, Abraham H. Terrorism and Hostage Negotiations Review authors, Robert E. Harkavy. The American Political Science Review, Varla. 75 No. 1, Martyr 1981. pp. 276-277. Pearl, Richard. America at a Crossroads, 2007 PBS. Paynak, Mr. President Milosevic is the problem. New York Times Week in Review. September 20th, 1998 link. PNAC Statement of Principles. Link accessed May 1st, 2007. Rambo, First Blood Part 2. Kuroko Pictures, 1985. Rambo, First Blood Part 2. Trailer, 1985. Rambo 3. Kuroko Pictures, 1988. Richard Pearl, The Making of a Neoconservative. Interview by Ben Wattenberg. Think. Tank with Ben Wattenberg, 2003. Rob David L. Operation Hollywood. Amherst, New York, Prometheus Books, 2004. Rocky IV, Chartoff Winkler Productions in 1986. Ronald Reagan quoted from a Cuban Independence Day celebration in Miami, Florida. May 20th, 1983. Suid, Lawrence H. Guts and Glory, The Making of the American Military Image in Film. Kentucky, The University Press of Kentucky, 2002. The Road Warrior. VHS box. Warner Brothers Video. Why We Fight. BBC. Storyville, 2005. Wilder Carroll. Style vs. Substance in the Rhetoric of Rambo from The War That Won't Die. Link. Will George. Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History. Afterwards. C-SPAN 2 Book TV.